Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the SAF Crystal Ball 2024 review and predictions for the journey to 2030. Thank you all for joining us today. My name's Roz. I'm the Content Director for Sustainable Aviation Futures MENA and North America. For those of you who don't know, Sustainable Aviation Futures hosts a global series of events looking at the high-level strategies involved in scaling aviation decarbonisation technologies and bring together the entire value chain to network, connect and discuss capabilities for scaling those solutions to reach net zero by 2050. Over the next 60 minutes, our panel of experts will be doing their very best to read the crystal ball of aviation decarbonisation, examining how the landscape has developed throughout 2024 and what that means for the next 5 years as we approach some ambitious 2030 sustainability targets set by the industry. I'd like to keep abreast of all of our upcoming events, training courses, and gain exclusive access to interviews and articles. Be sure to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, Spotlight. If you'd like more information about speaking, sponsoring, or attending any of our events or digital content, don't hesitate to contact one of the team. And finally, before I hand over to today's moderator, just a couple of bits of housekeeping for you all. The session is being recorded and will be distributed within the next few days after the webinar finishes. So if you have to leave or your internet connection drops or anything like that, don't worry, you won't miss out on the insights shared. Additionally, there should be a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So please make sure to ask your questions in there and we will try to get to as many as we possibly can. Finally, if you're having any technical difficulties, put those in the chat box and I'll do my best to help you. I'm pleased to hand over to our brilliant moderator, Jan Paul, the SAF Strategy and Investment Lead for the UK and Europe at PA Consulting. So without further ado, Jan, over to you.
Thanks, Roz. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm John. PA Consulting is one of the many players working in this really cool space of sustainable aviation fuels. My background has been primarily in the energy space, but it's always interesting to hear perspectives from across the value chain. And personally, for me, it's been a really interesting year in SAF. So I like to think of this webinar as sort of the Spotify Wrapped for SAF. If some of you are familiar with some of those end of year lists that you get, or top 10 movies of the year, you can think of this webinar as sort of the same, at least in the SAF space. It'll be interesting to hear from our panelists what different things mean for the SAF industry. But to me, I think the most interesting part of it has been quite a number of announcements this year. So, a lot of us are interested in this space and have seen a lot of SAF projects being announced over the past few years. But some projects have had, maybe a bit of a gloomier outlook. So some filing for Chapter 11, such as Fulcrum Bioenergy, other SAF projects being scrapped, Uniper Skyfuel H2 or the Shell Rotterdam Biofuels facility. And there's quite a number of announcements as well that have pushed back their FID dates or when they're actually investing in the project. So lots of good, bad, and ugly over the year in terms of SAF. I'll turn it to our panelists, and maybe I'll start with Amy and Bruce, who are some of the SAF producers at our panel. Amy, Bruce, again, it's been interesting for me to see what's been happening in the SAF production space, but from your perspective as some of the largest project owners, what do you think have been the main challenges for producers in this space in terms of making global SAF projects successful?
Well, maybe I'll take a run at it and ask Amy to give her perspective. Look, the industry is in a state of flux. Things are forming. A lot of choices are available to policymakers, to regulators, to participants, customers. It takes years to stand up a physical production site. The industry is moving faster than regulatory policy, and so it's a very uncertain time for anybody that wants to put capital to work. The uncertainty, and if I focus in on the regulatory climate, the regulatory uncertainty is probably the biggest challenge that everybody faces. As policy forms around the world, as it standardizes, as we solve easy things, for globally fungible commodities like fuel for aircraft, this is going to work a lot better in the future than it does now. And so if you make a bet and you invest money, with a certain regulatory and policy support mechanism in mind, and that changes, you're going to have a large problem. And once there's one example of that, a high-profile bankruptcy or the cancellation, in Europe of a really large project, that has a chilling effect on everybody else.
Yeah.
Amy?
Yeah, definitely. I think, not only it's the uncertainty in the regulations, but it's also the tight regulations around RF and BO qualification, specifically for e-fuels, that are pretty challenging. But we need to get those regulatory policies in place for sure in 2025. That is absolutely holding things up. We need clarity on the penalties in Europe. We need clarity on how the UK is going to roll out the regulatory and the policy for the contract for difference. In the US, we're still awaiting the IRA tax credit for the green hydrogen, right? So a lot of regulatory uncertainty. Another challenge that we see also is around the EU, the lack of EU support for EU production. I think the EU has tried to do what they can to incentivize SAF and eSAF production, but it's just not enough, and it's not to the producers, and it's not helping get long-term offtake agreements, which we need for bankability to get these projects built. And along that same vein is also there's no incentives in Europe, nothing. So we've been very happy at Arcadia eFuels that we were able to win a grant from the UK Advanced Fuels Fund. That's been instrumental in helping get our project off the ground there. And we're very happy in the US. We also won a grant, the FAST grant, which is also instrumental in helping get our project off the ground in the US. But our project in Denmark has received no support, not from Denmark and not from EU. So that's not been the best. And I would say the last challenge that we're facing specifically for eSAF is that CO2 is a raw material. And now we see more and more governments incentivizing, giving out large sums of money for companies to capture CO2 and sequester it. So it's creating a major competition, being able to use CO2 as an eSAF raw material. So now we have governments actually de-incentivizing eSAF production inadvertently with the money that they're throwing out for sequestration. So quite a few challenges in the space right now.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's quite a theme around policy and support from government, which we'll obviously come back to. I think there's different policy regimes across Europe, across the UK, across the US, and sort of the confluence of those different regimes is creating some challenges. I know we mentioned e-fuels. Raghu, I know you're very experienced in this space. What do you think have been the challenges, aside from those mentioned by Amy, specific to hydrogen and e-fuels? And how do you see some of these challenges playing out in specific markets that you're familiar with?
Yeah, maybe just to recap, I think Bruce and Amy both touched on those two key factors. One is the cost and the regulation, which is really, doubling down on the challenges that we are actually facing. And really, I mean, Amy touched on the RFNBO, and then if you really unpack it, it's really the guardrails that's been put to make sure that it is meeting certain criteria. It's complicating it further, and also on top of it, there is the demand stimulation through the mandates in Europe, whereas you have the production stimulation in the US. So it remains to be seen as to in which direction the SAF is going to flow from where. And all bets are right now in the direction that, from US to Europe, especially in terms of the e-fuels at this point in time, because like Amy mentioned, there is literally no incentives at all in Europe for production. We face the same challenge as well in smart energy with the two projects that we have in Portugal for the eSAF, where everything is up to the project developer to go build it on your own and figure out the way that you can really bring the cost down through some kind of a partnership or through collaborative work. So that's where we really see the challenges, because everything that you have to go figure it out by yourself at every step. And it's not the same, and it changes from one location to the other because the dynamics are different in different locations. In one location, you might have favorable power prices, but then not enough, CO2 access or not enough land access. Whereas the opposite, and that brings to the point, like, for example, I'm based out in Middle East, and you have a lot of land access. You have a lot of renewable energy access. But then where do you go for the CO2 over here? That would meet the RFNBO criteria. So it really, the regulations poses those added layers of challenges for the already struggling or already slowing market or the industry itself. And that's what we see even in the MENA region. But then what we also see in the MENA region is that when we talk about hydrogen, the whole region sees green hydrogen as an opportunity, wherein, this, you don't have CO2 need for this. So really, with the land access and with the renewable energy access, they see the hydrogen production as an opportunity, and also as an opportunity for exporting into Europe to fulfill Europe's demand as well. So I see that it could bring in a different perspective in the way it can trigger some kind of, because to bring those hydrogen into Europe should also meet the RFNBO criteria, which means that these are already ready for usage for ESAF production. So somehow it will change the dynamics over a period of time when these connections starts happening.
No, and that's a really good point. And that is, in fact, how I myself started getting involved in SAF, right? I used to not be involved in the SAF pathways or in aviation in general, but looking at the dynamics of renewable energy being turned into green hydrogen, especially now that there's a bit of a trouble with offshore wind, for example, in the global industry. That's definitely going to impact where green hydrogen is going to go. But also my involvement in biogenic carbon. And I think Amy sort of summarized it very, very well. We're at cross purposes in terms of carbon, right? Are we using some of this carbon to create some of these sustainable fuels if they're considered carbon neutral, or are we putting them into the ground, to create offsets? And there's sort of different dynamics that then come out of that. But speaking of some of those dynamics and trade flows that the panel have already mentioned, I'd just like to sort of summarize a few of the current views. I believe that in the UK, for example, we don't have a lot of capacity. And in fact, there is less than 500,000 tons of SAF expected by 2030. And so the UK is seen to be, at least at the moment, without enough capacity coming online, an importer of SAF, whereas the EU, assuming that some of the projects that it's announced will go through, will be meeting the standards that it's set for some of its mandates. And so there's a bit of a dynamic flow there. North America, on the other hand, is seen to be a major exporter of SAF, not only to the UK, but surprisingly to markets like Japan, for example, which has set some goals in terms of SAF. So again, there is really a difference in terms of where the supply is being incentivized, where the demand is being incentivized, and what that means for trade flows in terms of sustainable aviation fuels. Now, the policies, again, have been very different. Europe and the UK focusing a lot more on the stick, the US focusing a lot more on the carrot. And I think what policymakers don't realize is that the carrot and the stick have to come together. So there's a number of mandates coming online in 2025, including caps on HEFA SAF fuels and minimum uplifts of ESAF. ETS aviation emissions are reducing their allowances given to different players in the space. However, in the UK, there are grants, there is a revenue certainty mechanism that's supposed to be introduced from 2025, 2026. And so, there's a lot of different things coming in and slight inconsistencies, whereas the US, at least in the current administration, has been giving a lot more of the carrots, tax incentives, grants, loans to producers. Of course, that may all change come January next year. So maybe I'll turn it over to Amina and to Mason. Can either of you give maybe an overview of some of the positive policies and credits that exist in North America that you've seen have been supportive of SAF? And what do you think the incoming administration means for some of these interventions, such as the LCFS, the Clean Fuels Production Credits, and the IRA?
Thank you, John. I'm happy to get us started, and Mason, feel free to jump in and add on. So in my mind, there are really, three, main areas where we see the government be active. One relates to the Department of Energy, handing out grants and loans. The second bucket would be the Treasury supporting with federal tax credits. And the third one, at least on the federal level, is the Environmental Protection Agency with its RFS program. So for each of these three, there's some good news, and then there is, as Bruce mentioned earlier, quite a bit of uncertainty and risk as to what's going to happen under the new administration. So I'll just pick one to get started, but we can cover, throughout this program, really all three of these buckets that I outlined. So maybe starting with the grants, Amy mentioned that earlier, how they've benefited from the FAST SAF. So that program is running out this calendar year. So the big question is what's up for 2025, and the next one that people will be turning to is really under this, we call it the Title 17. It's a large program, and that has been funded a lot through the IIA. So that's where the funds are coming from. It's focused on innovative energy. So it's a pretty broad term. You're looking at new technologies. You're looking at improved technology with a focus on clean energy and greenhouse gas reductions. So what's going to happen to that program and to the funds that are currently made available for that program? If we look at what happened during the first Trump administration, the data unfortunately does not look good. There was essentially no new grants, no new loans committed under that program. So looking at the crystal ball going forward, what does that mean for the second Trump administration? Are we going to see a similar trend there? And my answer is probably not. I think it's going to be a little bit different this time around. And there's certain factors that support that view. One factor are agricultural interests. At least, to the extent SAF is based on biomass, there is, constituents behind that I think the new administration will want to support. The second one is just a matter of fact that a lot of the projects that are in progress right now are actually in Republican-run states. So you have the states as another opportunity to really focus and provide some pressure on continuing the program. And the third one is sort of a theme, like a bucket of different themes, and that's supporting American manufacturing, supporting American jobs, supporting American supply chains. So to the extent you can frame a project and frame your application to support these themes, that's also something that the new administration is likely going to see favorable. So hopefully, at least some new funds will be committed under this program also going forward. For those in the audience who may be in a status of conditional commitment, so I guess as you apply for funding, the final goal will be to have closure, to have a signed contract. Those are probably going to be fine. I think it's unlikely that they will be undone, but some projects are in the conditional phase. So for those, if you want to reduce your risk, getting them to closure would really be key, if at all possible, still under this administration. And then we cover what may or may not happen going forward. So that's the DOE side of things. I would turn next to the federal tax credits, but Mason, do you want to add anything on the DOE and grant and loan front before I do that?
No, go ahead. I mean, and I'll jump in on the tax credits too.
Okay, great. So on the tax credits, it's sort of a similar story. We had some credits available in this calendar year, but they're running out. Those are the SAF blender federal tax credits, so they will no longer be available going forward. So the big one people will, I think, be looking at is the clean fuel production federal tax credits. That's 45Z for those who are in the numbers. And there are three areas of risk or uncertainty that I would outline for that particular tax credit. The first one relates to registration. So in order to be able to claim a credit under the Clean Fuel Production Federal Tax Credit, the facility needs to be registered. And there's a certain form you submit, Form 637, and then the IRS actually needs to send you a letter, a registration letter. And the question is, are they going to get through everything, by January 1st? Or is there then going to be a delay as the new administration takes over and how to handle these forms and actually issuing signed registrations? There's also the opportunity for the government to revoke and suspend even an existing registration. So just that entire process of getting the facility registered is one area of uncertainty right now. The second one relates to really the merit, the substance of the credit. Under the statute, everyone was expecting to receive additional guidance from the government as of January 1st of 2025. That new guidance has not come through yet. And in fact, if you've been following the news this week, there have been sort of competing remarks from the government. There were some unclaimed sources, unnamed sources that said, maybe the current government will actually not issue that expected guidance before they leave. And then that has, I think, quickly been corrected by the spokesperson of the Treasury, who said, oh, no, the Treasury actually does anticipate that we'll get to that guidance and will give you at least enough so that the credit can be utilized. So that's really the, the second, big uncertainty. Are we going to get enough guidance to know how to know what methodology to use to calculate the greenhouse gas emission rate under that credit? And the third one is really the large question: what is the new administration going to do with taxes? We know they have the intent to go through a big reconciliation, so maybe restructure things, more generally. And that, as part of that overall restructuring, there is at least a chance they may also touch this clean fuel production tax credit, and potentially, frankly, even also the clean hydrogen production tax credit. So it's not clear what they're going to do as they're looking at things more broadly. To put maybe a little bit of a more positive spin as a final note on that, there was, as recent as September, a bipartisan push to extend the clean fuel production credit. It's currently set to last only for 3 years through 2027, and that push would bring it out to 2034, so additional 7 years, and only tied to a requirement that supply chain is domestic. And that push, again, was bipartisan. So that's giving some hope that there is going to continue to be support for these federal tax credits. So Mason, over to you.
Thanks, Amina. So I'll jump in kind of around the edges there. And as Amina was saying, that the current blender's tax credit under 40B is supposed to expire at the end of this year, and will be supplanted by the clean fuels production credit under 45Z. And that we're still awaiting guidance on 45Z. We have received guidance on the registration requirements, but in terms of the kind of emissions reduction specifications and calculations, there's a lot of uncertainty there. I don't expect that we'll receive sufficient guidance there under this administration. They may kind of punch in a little bit with some further information, but that I expect that uncertainty to remain throughout the remainder of this administration. And then the question would be, what do we expect to happen under the new administration? And you'll need something like $4 trillion in cuts to pay for the extension of the Trump tax cuts. So, and that's coming due in 2025, of course. So really nothing's off the table in terms of areas for potential cutting. But that said, I'd say it's less likely that the SAF-focused elements of the IRA tax credits will go away compared to, I think there's sunsetting potential for the wind, solar, storage, ITC, PTC. But with respect to SAF, the investment that major oil and agricultural players have made, and so much of that investment is taking place in Republican-leaning states, as Amina mentioned. But the other consideration, it's also much less expensive than other elements of the IRA. I mean, for SAF specifically, we're talking under current production levels, it's tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in tax credits, which is peanuts in the grand scheme of things. And even if you were to reach your kind of 3 billion gallon target by 2030, that's still sub 10 billion in terms of annual tax credits. And if you're exporting twice that much, maybe it's 10 to 15 billion, but very small compared to other elements of the IRA. And then the final thing there, and others have mentioned this, is with SAF, there's a lot of export potential. And I think that's one of the kind of exciting things here from a US policy perspective. And I think architects of the IRA would say, being the the entity that's on the push side of the carrot, as John was saying, with the incentives, all of that investment is happening here. And then the mandates are in UK, Europe, maybe increasingly in Asia. And I think that even for this administration, the potential to become a major exporter, and that's certainly a vision in terms of gas as well, I think will be enticing, and especially given the low cost, I think we're likely to see that the SAF tax credits maintained.
So it seems like, if I were to summarize, Amina, Mason, what the two of you have mentioned already, there's quite a not insignificant amount of uncertainty coming into this new administration, at least in terms of the support that was previously there, whether some of those things will be carried over. With some things, it's a little bit more certain and a bit gloomier that, Trump says on day one, he's going to stop a whole bunch of offshore wind projects, which could impact green hydrogen production in the US. And other fields around, biofuels, maybe slightly more positive given the involvement of the agricultural sector or in some cases the oil and gas sector. So it seems like there's a number of places where there's cause to be optimistic, a number of places where maybe less so, but all around quite a bit of uncertainty. Bruce, Amy, I know the two of you are sort of hungry for some of that certainty, right? Whether it's in terms of the policies or some of the grants or the loans that your projects have received. Can you maybe highlight for the audience how some of those policies have been good for your projects, other places where maybe not as good for your projects, and maybe you can kick us off across the panel. What more do you need from both the Trump administration, but maybe the global policy landscape to support production of SAF?
You going first, Bruce? Okay, I'll go.
It's your turn. Your turn.
Yeah, so I think that we started Arcadia eFuels with the intention of doing the right thing and not relying on regulation. So we feel we have designed a very sustainable project, and we were hoping the regulations would catch up. That's been 3 years now. We're still waiting on the regulations to catch up. I do believe that, in the US, as long as the $3 per kilogram hydrogen credit keeps extending, I think that's very positive for ESAF, and that's what we need to see happen in the US. We also would like to see the DOE loan program continue, because these projects are very capital intensive. I mean, in the billions of euros of capital. So having a DOE loan guarantee is quite helpful. So that's what we really like to see in the US. I think in the UK, we need to have better clarity on how the actual contract for difference is going to work, what happens with penalties, how all that stuff kicks in, I think is going to be very important in the UK. And then in general, in Europe is just a lot of work to do there, right? There's just tremendous amount of work to do in Europe. The RFNBO regulations are still confusing. There's exemption to use fossil-based CO2 as a feedstock, but then it doesn't work with your being over 70% CI score. So there's just a lot of confusion around those regulations. We need clarity there. We need Europe to step up and have incentives for producers, or even airlines that can commit to a long-term 10, 12-year offtake agreement. Right now, the current ETS system does not work for that at all. So lots of challenges and lots of work that we need to have in Europe. I'll say that I guess there's a question about what I said earlier about Europe's de-incentivizing ESAF, and that's exactly right. I mean, first of all, the EU Innovation Fund just came out, which is a large amount of money. It's a fantastic initiative from Europe, but basically no SAF or ESAF projects were awarded this year. And again, it's because the way the program is set up, it's set up that it's the euros per CO2 reduced. And so what happens is all these carbon capture projects are going to win hands down every time. So you have that piece going in, which is competing with SAF and ESAF projects. And at the same time, you have governments that are giving money for people to sequester CO2. So what that's effectively doing is almost doubling the biogenic CO2 price that we need to buy for SAF. So it's basically a disincentivation to produce SAF and ESAF in Europe than it is to do in US or UK or other parts of the world.
Yeah, so I think the the panel has made a number of important points, and if I kind of integrate those for the audience, the regulators have a challenge here, but there are points of light. So you've kind of heard from all of us that regulatory policy is actually not working. It's not encouraging the formation of this industry, and there are specific examples of things that are counterproductive. But the reason for that is not, sorry for the double negative coming, it's not because the regulators are not interested in driving this transition. They are, but it's coming from too many pieces of the puzzle. This is a large, complex, existing value chain, and one would be well advised to touch it gently. Let's not have dramatic change and dramatic surgery performed upon aircraft that need to stay at 40,000 feet. So, the law of unintended consequences, or the first do no harm, take your choice. I think policy and regulation has been respectful of this. So if I gave you a positive example, I mean, I happen to be sitting in Washington, D.C. at the moment. The Department of Energy is running a 2-day convocation, and they're bringing all kinds of players and perspectives together here. This is actually an agency that's done a very, very good job here. And specifically what I mean by that is they recognize that we are in the incubation stage of sorting out a lot of these choices. They're not making the classical error of picking a winner. Picking a winner is a disaster when something is trying to form. And yet we've got people doing that. We've had interference. The HEFA crowd, where I sit, has had interference in what feedstocks are preferred. Are you kidding me? We've got a long way to go before we need to worry about that. So the cost of incubating is actually quite low, as was noted, and I think that's forced. The cost of scaling up is going to be quite high, and it's going to be untenable if we pick the wrong winner. So let's just wait a minute on the policy. Let's pull back and say it's a global commodity, and uniquely for SAF, that aircraft, you can write national policies that stop at the border all you want. The aircraft is not going to. The aircraft is going to fill up with SAF in jurisdiction 1, and it is going to fly that SAF to jurisdiction 2. And if those policies in those 2 jurisdictions don't harmonize, good luck scaling it. So the very simplest thing that anybody could do is just take a deep breath. Let's have some of the more tactical regulatory interventions stand down for a bit. I'm not going to bludgeon the bad examples, but several have been named, and frankly, it's obvious that those regulators think there must already be an industry out there. We're trying to form one. Let's stay up on the level of policy. National interest is not repealed. In North America, Montana Renewables is the largest SAF producer that you never heard of. We produced and sold more gallons of SAF in the Western Hemisphere than anybody else this year of 2024. You'd think some of these folks would want to talk to us, but they don't. I'm not sure who they are talking to. And, if we can change that, if we can have a seat at the table, we have some very practical suggestions from someone that's actually doing this for a living. And I think that would go a long way. We are very pleased the DOE has been willing to listen to that. So as a result of the DOE listening to us, we've got net zero hydrogen inside of our production envelope. We've got SAF recovered from renewable diesel. There's easily 600 million gallons of SAF. I could snap my fingers and say literally tomorrow, if everybody like us would also fish the SAF out of the renewable diesel. But they're not going to when the policy support mechanisms are a lot more clear for diesel than they are for SAF. So, there's some very, very easy or low-hanging fruit that we could collectively tackle. I like the DOE. They understand the industry that they are observing and trying to help incubate. They've done a very, very exhaustive due diligence process in order to come to us and say, you look like you're at least going to pay the taxpayers back if we give you this loan. It was recognizable to a private sector participant like me. You know, I've spent many decades in energy and in finance, and the DOE is doing this to the standard that you would all like to see. An excellent success story. If we go around the table, we've got farm policy up. All of the HEFA, feedstocks start in acreage, whether they are crops or whether they are waste products from the animal protein value chain, whether they are byproducts from on-purpose ethanol production, or whether they are used cooking oil. You know, they all started in acreage if you trace it back, and so you're straight to farm policy.
Yeah, so it does
you know,
sound like there's a bit more harmony that needs to happen, not only on the global level, but across sectors when it comes to SAF. And that's definitely the case here in the UK, for example, where only recently have the Department for Transport and the Department for Energy realized that they need to be talking to each other in the way that, I would say Mason and myself talk to our aviation colleagues about SAF and SAF policy. So it needs to be a cross collaboration across those sectors. Again, energy, transport, agriculture, trade. There's a number of those things that need to happen. Raghu, Mason, Amina, any of you have any sort of policy wish list items that you might have off the top of your head?
I was going to add to one item that Bruce mentioned. He mentioned the sort of interchangeability of renewable diesel and SAF. I think there is a big opportunity here for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to help, make it move, make production move more towards SAF if that's what the policy wanted. And it's very easy. There is what we call an equivalence value. So you can generate right now between 1.6 to 1.7 RINs per gallon of for renewable diesel that you produce. And whether you get 1.6 or 1.7 RINs depends on your energy content of your fuel. But at least there's the opportunity to go up to 1.7. And I understand that many in the industry actually do get the 1.7 RINs per gallon. If you look at SAF, by contrast, it's set at 1.6. So there is that little margin, but what the regulator, the EPA, could do if they wanted to provide incentives is to move up that equivalence value for SAF. And if you were able to generate more RINs for SAF compared to renewable diesel, that would be an incentive to move your production to SAF as opposed to renewable diesel. And then tied to that, we call this RVOs, renewable volume obligations, and the related percentage standards. Those are currently set by EPA for the coming year for 2025, but they will then have the responsibility to set new targets for 2026 and going forward. And if those volume obligations and those percentage standards are set at a level to incentivize, additional, having additional RINs in the market for sale, then that could also, overall foster the demand for SAF. So those are two sort of, screws, so to speak, that the Environmental Protection Agency could turn pretty easily to help with increased demand for SAF.
Great, thanks, Amina. And yeah, again, there are a number of different policy levers that can be pulled here, right? There's global policy that needs to be figured out, even in the field of book and claim, for example, which is probably one of the aspects that needs to be solved if we are going to have trade around SAF. SAF, in its essence, is very difficult to move from one place to another to then be used in that destination. So some of these things do need to be put into place. And in order to do that, there needs to be a few more, I guess, technological innovations as well. So maybe slightly on the more positive note of what has happened throughout the year, there have been quite a number of positive developments in SAF. So for example, there was a recent flight where they measured that 100% SAF is actually possible. SAF obviously at the moment being thought of as more of a blend or drop-in fuel, but it has been proven that we can decarbonize all of the fuel in a plane, and seeing what happens there. Some advances in some of the pathways for SAF, not only with potential new pathways such as methanol to jet, but also existing pathways such as new sources for some of the feedstocks that go into SAF. So some new waste feedstocks, some new sources of oils for HEFA, and so on. Maybe I'll turn to Raghu, because there's quite a bit of technology that needs to happen. Are there any technology opportunities or developments that you in particular are excited about, or anything that you think needs to be solved 2025 to 2030?
It's interesting you mentioned methanol to jet. I mean, it will be a very welcoming outcome, I would say, from my perspective or from our perspective, but rather more not from a cost advantage angle at all, but then more from the point of flexibility, because I think that once methanol to jet option comes into picture, it gives the flexibility or the optionality that, you know, the end product can also be methanol, e-methanol for the shipping industry, whereas, you know, it can also be a feedstock for the eSAF. So then it really opens up the possibility of, from an off-taking perspective as well, in terms of more players to play, for you to play with that particular off-taking for that particular project to make it more viable. So I think that would be a very interesting technology perspective in terms of the approval of the e-methanol itself. Whereas from a wish list, or rather what would be interesting to see, is in terms of how can we make this these technologies, existing technologies, a bit more flexible, such as, you know, the Fischer-Tropsch reverse water gas shift for the eSAF process approved right now have certain limitations, like a minimum capacity of 2,000 barrels per day, which translates to what, 250 megawatt equivalent of a PV plant. That might not be relevant in places where there is abundant land or there is offshore wind, for example, but then in mainland Europe, the access for such large piece of land would also be limited. So how can we probably bring in more flexibility or certain level of modularization on this, that we can, you know, build on it over a period of time? That would also be very interesting. And I'm also quite excited to see the developments in the direct air capture, and hopefully at some point in time, you know, the cost comes down, and along with the efficiency in that technology, that'll help with the scaling up of the SAF itself.
Yes, especially I think there's a question in the chat about CCS and SAF being developed together. Of course, incentives might act a different way, where they're incentivizing CCS that doesn't necessarily go into SAF, but completely agree that the decarbonization landscape is not a zero-sum game, right? We're all trying to push for the same thing. We're all trying to move towards, you know, whether it be net zero or a reduction of emissions. And there is no easy path, right? There is no, I would say, glide path towards net zero in the way that some people think there is. It's quite a circular, bumpy ride. And what we've been doing here is, you know, mixing our predictions with some of the things that we want to happen, right? And unfortunately, in our industry, you will tend to do that, because what we see as needing to happen isn't necessarily what's going to happen. And so maybe I'll wrap up this group, maybe going around the panel with thinking that this is our crystal ball kind of panel. Maybe looking back and looking forward, what's one lesson that you think the industry learned in 2024 that you would like it to apply in the future? Or alternately, what is your fearless prediction for the SAF industry in 2025 and beyond? Maybe we'll start in Mason.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I'd say in terms of lessons learned, I mean, I think incentive stacking is critical. I think, you know, whether you're talking about the IRA tax credits, the federal RFS, RINs, as well as LCFS credits, and I think RINs under the Renewable Fuel Standard, there's a little bit more uncertainty there. It would take an act of Congress to move away from it, and it enjoys broad bipartisan support. So I don't really see that happening, but you could see, as we saw under the first Trump administration, when Pruitt's EPA had small refinery exemptions, putting downward pressure on prices. On LCFS side, and I think on the state support side in general, I think that's going to be something that we see a lot more of as states kind of take leadership again in the absence of federal leadership on the climate side of things. And you will see the LCFS in California, for example, is going to get enhanced, is going to get a little more SAF friendly and put limits on renewable diesel, which will shift renewable diesel production to SAF. And I think other states will adopt LCFSs or equivalent programs, which will help drive investment and also drive considerations around locational considerations and where to build, et cetera.
Thanks, Mason. Amy, your lesson learned or fearless prediction?
Yeah, I think that we've learned a lot in 2024 that people want to produce SAF all across the board, all different pathways. It's a fantastic product. It's a great way to decarbonize. So that's been fantastic. The learning on that is we have the willingness as an industry. The airlines we're now seeing more and more offtake agreements. So all that is willing. I hope that my prediction would be that the regulators hear that, see that, and will really smooth the way going forward. I think there was one question I just wanted to address on the EU Hydrogen Bank, because that is another great incentive that Europe has. But again, if you look at last year's bids, the highest bid was under 50 cents euro cent per kilogram. That's in contrast to the US, which is $3 per kilogram hydrogen credit, right? And then in the US, if you produce it, I think Bruce said it really well. There's no winner. Like you produce, you get the credit. Whereas in Europe, you're making a bid. It could be political. You have to have a letter of credit. So developers don't have assets to have letters of credit. So it's a totally different mechanism there. So what I would hope is that we look forward to 2025 with Europe, that the penalties get fixed, that becomes clear, and we start to see projects get to FID and financial close in 2025 to prepare for the mandates coming up on ESAF in 2030.
Thanks, Amy. Raghu, how about you?
I would say timing, the speed is key. That's the biggest learning in 2024 for me and for the industry to a certain extent, because the need has been established through the energy trilemma and then on all those, the classical stuff, but then it's time for action. The speed of making it a reality is very important. And yes, Amy spoke about some of the hurdles that's been put in place, which is actually slowing us down. But then we really need to look at how can this be accelerated? And it's not just the regulators, it's everybody, every player have to own it up and start having a game, start playing the game. Like, it's even the off-takers, it's even enabling the voluntary market. And we have corporates and business aviation who can really create the push into the market itself that can give more concrete signals that can accelerate the uptake as well. So that would be the key for me as a learning.
Thanks. What about you, Bruce? Your key learning or fearless prediction?
Well, the fearless prediction is that we're drawing to a close on a first chapter of experimentation. A lot of people have put a lot of thought into a lot of different things. That sets us up very, very well to harness the creativity that will follow. There are new discoveries, there are new insights. I heard about the importance of contrails for the first time a year ago. That's going to lead to, better development, better participation. And it's pretty clear that the world wants to go this direction, but they're looking to people like these panelists to say how. And then these panelists are sending a clear signal to regulators that if we could get a little bit of a dialogue going and join up some of these otherwise disparate experimentations, we're probably ready. We're probably primed to be very powerful and accelerate this thing. The US EPA could tomorrow put out the RVO adjustments that free up 600 million gallons of SAF. It'll pop out of the diesel pool that readily. Or they could take that the other direction. That was a huge learning. That wasn't obvious 2 years ago. Now it is. So, we're poised at the leaping off spot. for something that's going to be huge, and everybody on the call here is going to be part of that. It's going to be fascinating to watch it unfold.
Thanks, Bruce. Amina, what about you?
I think what this, the past 50 minutes have shown, the SAF industry is a young industry. So, a lot of things are still in flux. And in order to make sure that it thrives, going forward, that will really depend, at least in part, on the government. The government providing an appropriate regulatory framework for it. But then also at some point, at least, provide the necessary certainties so people know how to act. So I think that gives opportunity to a lot of players. So if we, for the US, look at the federal level and the state level, it gives a lot of opportunity to the federal level. We've discussed today in detail the EPA and the opportunities the Environmental Protection Agency has there with the RFS program. We've talked about the Department of Energy. What I wanted to add there is, in addition to them sort of thinking about the scope, what are the kind of industries, what are the kind of technologies that we want to support? They may also tweak a little bit the requirements. So right now, there has been a pretty big focus on what we call environmental justice. There's been quite a bit of focus on labor interests, on labor requirements. So one prediction is, and this may be a more positive sort of spin to things, that some of these restrictions may get eased. So there will be less focus on environmental justice requirements as part of your loan and grant application, and that there may be less of a focus on labor standards. And then tied to that, I mean, really how the DOE program was set up is to provide for clean energy and to be pretty strict on it being environmentally friendly. But even in order, even that sort of core message and that core goal may get relaxed a little bit. I mean, there may be projects that are in the interest of the new administration, and they may be willing to approve certain projects, even if their greenhouse gas reduction is not quite as high as what the current administration may want to see. And then on the Treasury side, as we discussed, there's some uncertainty. There's some need just for additional guidance, and there is the overall risk that just the reconciliation of the tax program overall. What I do want to mention is that the federal tax credits are really quite a big opportunity for the United States, sort of as a player. For people to come into the country to be able to take advantage of, become a U.S. taxpayer and then take advantage of this program. And there is actually the opportunity for direct pay to monetize on these tax credits. So it's not just that you have a tax saving, but for certain corporations, if you're tax exempt, there's actually an opportunity to get direct cash, or at least to use it to transfer to sell the credits that you have. So that's just another big aspect of that program that incentivizes companies also to come to the US and become an active player in SAF production. And then to close this out, so that's a big opportunity on the federal level. And Mason mentioned that a little bit. If the new administration were not to step up and not to utilize these opportunities, then that would create more opportunities for the states. We're already seeing clean fuel programs in several states, and even if it's not an official clean fuel program, there could be other incentives to attract businesses to make them come to their state and make it business friendly to pursue these projects.
Great, thanks, Amina. And I mean, yeah, as for my fearless prediction, right, I think some of the panels have already touched on the need for better policy. I do think the EU in particular is going to have to give on one of its sort of planks of policy. At the moment, it feels that it's sufficient for the mandates to drive some of both the demand and supply. But my fearless prediction is that without support for supply in terms of incentives, it's either going to have to loosen something in terms of imports, right? Whether that is biofuels from the US or other regions, or sources of used cooking oil from, let's say, Asia and China. Or it might have to push back some of the mandates that it has in place, right? So it can't have all three sticks in place. Probably one of those things is going to give way. I hope it is the incentives that we are supporting, that we do have more capacity coming online in the EU, and we are continuing to be as ambitious as it has been said. But again, this is all crystal ball gazing into the future for this panel. Right. Well, thank you, everybody. It was such a great time chatting with all of you. We do have time for one or two questions, and I'll just pick out a few in the chat that I think I've had my eye on for a while. One question in particular was, besides the US and Europe, which other markets globally should we be watching out for? And what kinds of policies do we expect from those countries? So I can take a stab at that. Some of the regions that haven't necessarily been in the conversation, but I think are key regions are Latin America and Asia in particular. So Latin America has an interesting dynamic in terms of trade flows for the production of biofuels and other inputs into SAF. Now the question is, where do some of those inputs go? Do they go to the US? You know, as trade policy with the Trump administration going to allow for that? Or are they going to the EU? You know, in terms of providing some of that foundation for HEFA and alcohol-to-jet SAF. The other region in particular is Asia. So Asia is interesting in that it is also starting to put in place some of the incentives for some of the feedstocks, as well as mandates for the use of SAF. One joke that I heard at a conference was that an FID in Asia is much more, gives more confidence than an FID in Europe, because they don't announce their projects until FID. And so while we might not hear a lot coming out of Asia in terms of projects for SAF production, that doesn't mean that there's nothing happening there. And so I would say those are the two regions to watch, at least in terms of global flows of SAF.
And John, if I may add, there is also the UAE roadmap for SAF as well, which they are looking at implementing it as a mandate by, I think, 2028, once they have certain visibility of local production capabilities.
Thanks, Raghu. I'll take another question, and maybe this is me merging two of the questions. We've repeatedly mentioned sort of trade flows from the US to Europe in 2025. I guess a question more generally to the panel, how do we see this happening, right? What sort of needs to be in place for that kind of trade flows of SAF to happen? Mason, do you want to kick us off with that one?
Sure. I mean, I see that export really picking up over time. Of course, we could use better book and claim and more universal book and claim considerations. It doesn't make sense to ship SAF to Europe in a boat when you can fly it there. I do think we'll see some more clarity coming there. There's going to be major issues reaching kind of consensus internationally, of course, but I think that is what really makes the IRA such good policy. And so from the US perspective, to keep moving down that track and seeing a lot of investment in the US and demand in Europe and UK and Asia is kind of exactly where policymakers want to be. And I think that will support the industry going forward.
Great. Anybody else have any views on some of those trade flows? Maybe one of our producers, AB, Bruce?
John, I was just going to say that, I mean, I think that you mentioned something earlier about the incentive, the mandates. I mean, I don't think the mandates in Europe will go away. And so if there's not incentives for producers, it's clear that product will be imported into Europe. And it would be a shame to use all those European tax dollars to support companies producing the US or even China. I mean, we're already seeing that happening with e-methanol for the shipping industry. You know, 2 large e-methanol contracts have been signed with Chinese e-methanol producers. So this is going to keep happening if we can't find a way to give some incentives to local European production.
Yeah, I'll simply say the fuels industry has spent a century making things efficient. A major portion of that is reducing unnecessary costs, like moving gallons of product from here to there, and you know, dropping onto a boat to go up to, let's just say, Copenhagen, and unloading into a plane that turns around and flies back to Washington, D.C. is, well, senseless.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And again, thank you to the audience for joining us for this panel. Hopefully it's been insightful, at least, or at least everybody is looking forward to the SAF industry in 2025. So with that, I'll say thank you to the panel, thank you to the audience, and a few weeks there, but have a good new year when we get there.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I want to say a huge thank you to our panel and our audience. And that was really, really insightful. I got wrapped up in the conversation myself, sitting in the background and trying to monitor the Q&A, but too busy listening to you all. To all of our audience, if you would like to learn more about everything that's been discussed today, please make sure to visit sustainableaviationfutures.com for full details about all of our events, training courses, and SAF Spotlight. Thank you all again. This has been fantastic, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and happy holidays. Thank you.